April 24th from 1 to 3 o'clock. The crafty ladies are going to be bottling hats. But on Saturday the 5th, the information is also on your website. Now tonight our special performance, and I should say da-da-da-da-da, because this is a feature performance. The Presidents and the First Ladies. They have been here several times, but some of you may not have seen them before. So I would like to just give you a little bio of them. Presidents and their First Ladies, dramatically speaking, is a creation of the veteran acting and writing team of husband and wife, William and Sue Wills. After two decades of operating their own theatrical company in the resort of Ocean City, Maryland, the couple is now in their 16th year of bringing to life the stories of 32 different presidential couples, making over 300 presentations every year. Now they're in a somewhat semi-retired state right now, so they don't do that many. Amazingly, the Wills have appeared together on stage over 8,000 times, and still counting. They're not impersonators, but hope that their costumes, dialects, and demeanors will help recreate these historical characters. Mr. and Mrs. Wills has performed in 31 of our 50 states and at 8 of the nation's presidential museum and historic sites. They're a true working team with William researching and creating the scripts, while Sue edits his work and creates the costumes, many of her own design. One patron observed that Congress should declare them a living national monument. With their Presidents and First Ladies program, William and Sue hope that by presenting the personal side of first couples, they'll become more than just names read about in the history books. Today, they proudly present to us the story of our 26th President and First Lady, Theodore and Edith Roosevelt. That's here.
As I stood in Unitarian Church in Brookline, Massachusetts, on October 27th, 1880, my heart broke as I watched the only boy in the world I ever cared about say wedding vows to another woman. At the reception afterwards, I defiantly danced the soles off my shoes. 6 weeks later, I watched as that boy's sister, my closest friend Corinne, made her debut. Something I had never been able to do because of my father's declining fortune. I was 19 years old, and many thought on my way to becoming a spinster. Well, I could have married for money, I suppose, but decided to not even try. I would wait, because in my heart I knew that somehow, someday I would marry that boy, Theodore Roosevelt. Mine was a lifelong love affair. Although I was born in Norwich, Connecticut in 1861, by the time I was 2, my family was living off East 14th Street in New York City, where I played in Union Square Park with little Corinne Roosevelt, soon coming to know her older brothers, Elliot and Teedy, as the family called him. Well, Teedy was my favorite, and I even let him play house, with me as the mummy and he as the daddy. When we attended dancing school together, I made sure I danced most of all with Teedy. Theodore, you may join in if you wish.
Delighted. I was born on October the 27th, 1858 on East 20th Street in New York City. I had a older sister, Mammy, a younger brother, Elliot, and a younger sister, Corinne. But I was a very sickly child, suffered terribly from asthma. But with the encouragement of my father, I made my body over. And yes, Edie was a favorite playmate of mine when we were small. The only problem was we were just separated so much because my family would always take these long trips to Europe and such. I remember one time, I cried all the way down to the docks, and I wrote in my diary that night, it was so hard parting from my friend. But then I became older, interested in other things, bugs and such. I even started my own Roosevelt Museum of Natural History in my bedroom. And my interest in Edith waned just a bit. My childhood education was basically through tutors. However, I did enter Harvard in 1876. Now, at this age, my interest in Edie had been revived. You know, when Edie dresses well and don't frizzle her hair, she is a very pretty girl.
While Theodore was away at school, I took a trip to Washington, and I went through the White House with other tourists. I wrote back to Corinne. Today, for the first time I went to the White House, how unlikely it is that I shall ever again come in contact with it.
And then on February the 9th, 1878, the best man I ever knew, my father, passed on from this world. He combined strength and courage with gentleness, tenderness, and a great unselfishness. I could never truly explain to you the unique bond I felt with my father, except to tell you that night I wrote in my diary, would to God I could do something to keep his memory alive. And it would be that thought, trying to live up to my father's memory, which would compel me throughout my years in government service. Then in August of that very same year, I did spend 3 lovely days with Edith.
Sailing one day,
And rowing the next.
a drive and a picnic the following day.
And then our rendezvous in the summer house. Alone.
And you were not nice. After that incident, Theodore and I broke up. You may continue this story on your own.
Oh, very well, Edith. This must be one of your bad days that come along occasionally. All right, I shall. Where was I? Oh, yes. In 1884, I decided to go west to the Dakota Badlands and to run my cattle ranch, Elkhorn, which was along the Little Missouri River.
Thee, you could not just jump from 1878 to 1884. You need to let them know what happened in between.
And Edith, you know very well I do not discuss those things. Now, if you wish to impart that knowledge, you may do so, but I will stand here and I will not be listening.
Well, it was during those years that Theodore met Alice Hathaway Lee, and it was their wedding that I attended. I must admit, she was a beautiful girl, but a bit boring for my taste. Well, after their wedding, Teddy, as she liked to call him, was elected to the state assembly, where he served for 2.5 years and made quite a name for himself. Then occurred that horrible Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1884. You see, on February 12th, Alice had given birth to a beautiful baby girl, whom they also named Alice. Well, early the next day, Thee's brother Elliot sent him a telegram telling him to come home immediately. Their mother was dying in a downstairs room, while upstairs, Theodore's wife, Alice, was also facing death due to complications brought on by Bright's disease, a kidney disease. Well, that morning, Theodore watched his loving mother pass on. Then he cradled his wife in his arms until she, too, passed away. After the burial, Theodore never mentioned his wife again, not even to his daughter. Well, this may seem harsh, but to Theodore that is how great grief should be handled, as he later wrote to another who had suffered a great tragedy.
The only thing for her to do now is to treat the past as past and out of her life. Though she cannot wholly avoid thinking of it, she can avoid speaking of it.
It was then that Thee left the state legislature and went west. Well, over the next year and a half, Theodore would return to New York for visits, but he seemed to be purposely avoiding me.
Absolutely, because I was now destined to be a bachelor. For in those days, men who married a second time were thought to have a character defect.
Well, knowing how he felt, I arranged my visits to see Theodore's sister, Bammy, at times when I knew that Theodore would not be there. Then in the fall of 1885, as I was leaving from a visit, Theodore arrived home. Our eyes met for the first time in 19 months. We began to meet, at first secretly, but on November 17th, Thee proposed to me. We decided to postpone the wedding, however, out of Theodore's concern for how people would view such a quick remarriage. So he went back west, and I went to Europe, where my family was now living.
Edith and I wrote to each other, and I just loved receiving her letters, even if they did include slight reprisals.
Well, of course, you absurd Mr. T.R. I do not wish you to write often if you do it as a duty. But if you do it for pleasure, as I write you, then we both can enjoy your letters. I do not think you sentimental in the least to love nature. Please, love me too. And believe me, I think of you all the time. I want so much to see you.
I returned to New York City and ran unsuccessfully for the mayor of New York in November of 1886. 1 week later, my sister Anna, Bambi, and I, under assumed names, set sail for Europe. And there, on December the 2nd, 1886, in London, England, Edie and I were wed. I was 28, she was 25. Now, we took a honeymoon tour of Europe, and when we returned home, we moved into our new home out on Oyster Bay, my beloved Sagamore Hill. And I settled down to what I thought might be my lifelong career, that of an author. Well, I had already published 2 very successful books. In fact, in my lifetime, I would have over 2,000 published works, books, magazine articles, newspapers, and articles and such, and wrote over 150,000 letters.
And I immediately became a mother. Theodore's sister Anna, or Bammy as everyone called her, had been taking care of little Alice. Now, 3 years old, she came to live with us. And from the start, I was mother to her. Theodore and I got to know each other again, and life for me at Sagamore Hill was perfect. I would have been happy living in seclusion on Long Island, but as Theodore would teach me over the years, one should not live to oneself. Theodore could certainly not spend his days in seclusion.
In 1888, I campaigned out west for Benjamin Harrison. And when he was elected, I was offered a job on the newly formed Civil Service Commission. But that would mean moving the family to Washington.
I did not want to do that. Our family was growing. We had our own son, Ted, and I was pregnant again. Plus, we did have financial difficulties. Theodore had lost quite a lot of money on his cattle ranch, and Sagamore Hill had cost an astounding $16,000 to build. Could we get by on a government salary, maintain 2 homes, and take care of a growing family?
But Edie, I would be dealing with reform. Please.
Well, I agreed to the move. However, I remained at Sagamore Hill until our second son, Kermit, was born. But Theodore, having moved on ahead, was not at my side. It seemed to me that whenever I was with the child, he absented himself for long periods of time, leaving me alone to manage the household. I wrote to him, "Do be very careful. I try not to worry about you, but it is hard. And though, of course, you have been away much, and I am accustomed to not seeing you in the house, still, it has been a hopeless kind of summer. And all I can think of are the times that you have been here, our lovely rows together, the long drives. I wish I were gayer for the children's sake. Alice needs someone to laugh and romp with her
instead of a sober and staid person like me. My darling, you are all the world to me. I am not myself when you are away. Do not forget me or love me less." In late December, Edith and the children arrived in Washington. And I believe the 6 years I spent on the Civil Service Commissions were very happy ones for Edith. Well, she enjoyed the people in Washington, and she did spend many hours in the growing Smithsonian Institution. And I made a name for myself by exposing corruption. For example, in a Republican primary election in Baltimore, Maryland, we uncovered that there was voting fraud and bribery. I walked up to one gentleman, one of the participants, and I said to him, "You tell me, sir, how do you do your cheating?" And he looked me right in the eye and said, "Sir, we do our cheating honorably." In late summer of 1894, I heard that the Republican Party of New York City was very certain of winning the next mayoral election, and they wanted me to be their nominee. I would now have a chance to redeem myself for that election loss back in 1886.
Theodore, we do not have the finances to make such a race. What we have now is better than nothing, which is what you'll have if you lose that mayoral race for the second time.
And the party men, they wanted me as well. I gave in to Edith's wishes. And then I left for a trip to the Badlands.
When I discovered how much that race had meant to Theodore, I was despondent. He never should have married me. Then he would have been free to make his own choice. This is a lesson that will last my lifetime. Never to give my opinion, for it is utterly worthless when given. And added to these troubles was the tragedy of his brother.
My dear brother Elliot had a problem with alcohol most of his adult life. And then within just a short 2-year period, his beautiful wife and one of his children died. Elliot's life just deteriorated after that. And in August of 1894, at the age of only 34 years old, Elliot died a tragic death, leaving behind his little son Hall and his daughter Eleanor to be brought up by members of his wife's family. Meanwhile, our family grew, as I believed that it was the duty of the upper class to have large families. So, joining Ted and Kermit, there was Ethel in 1891 and Archibald in 1894. I then spent the next 2 years on the New York City Police Commission, bringing to that very fine organization my philosophy of the strenuous life. Then in '96, I campaigned for William McKinley, and when he won that election, this time I was offered a job in his administration that I could accept with bully enthusiasm, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy.
So it was back to Washington, and this time to an even nicer home at 1810 N Street, opposite the British Embassy. And on November 19th, 1897, our 5th child, Quentin, was born.
And then sickness visited our door. Edith seemed to be recovering quite well from her delivery. She spent a cheery Christmas. But for years, Edith had endured chronic migraine headaches. And oftentimes I wondered that she just did not take good care of herself. But now in early January, she began to suffer acute neuralgia pains and sciatica. On January the 17th, her fever rose to 101 degrees and never fell below that point for the next 4 weeks. Meanwhile, President McKinley was dealing with the problem of Cuba, where many Americans, myself included, wanted the United States to help the Cuban rebels throw off that oppressive Spanish rule. However, the president was taking a very diplomatic approach. He sent our battleship, the USS Maine, into Havana as an act of friendly courtesy. On February the 15th, the USS Maine exploded and sank in that harbor, killing 266 of the 350 sailors on board. Again, although President McKinley took a very cautious approach, he enlisted a commission to go down to Cuba to discover the cause of the explosion. I now felt that war with Spain was imminent, and I told the president that if it came, I would resign my position and his administration, and I would wanted to go and fight on the front lines.
Well, on February 22nd, I noticed an ominous swelling in my abdomen. The diagnosis was an abscess near the hip, and surgery was recommended. It would be nearly 6 weeks before I fully recovered. And I recovered at just the right moment, for on April 19th, Congress resolved for Cuban independence, a virtual declaration of war on Spain, which officially occurred on April 25th. Theodore resigned his administration position and became second in command under Colonel Leonard Wood over a regiment made up of frontiersmen, marksmen, and horsemen, the unit everyone referred to as Roosevelts Rough Riders. Theodore now had his war for which he had been itching for years. And I was glad that I recovered, so he would not have had to make the choice of either going to war or staying by my side. Although I know what his choice would have been. He would have gone to war.
Well, it was my last chance to do something for my country and my family, and my one chance to cut a notch on that stick that stands as a measuring rod in every man's family. I know now. I would have left my wife's deathbed to have answered that call.
I wrote to Theodore, "Come back safe, darling pigeon, and we shall be happy. But it is quite right that you should be where you are."
Leaving from Tampa, we arrived in Cuba in mid-June. Our first skirmish was at a pass known as Las Guasimas. We held our positions there for about a week, but disease was already decimating our troops, including some of the officers. Because of this, Colonel Wood was advanced to Brigadier General, and I was advanced to a full colonel in charge of the volunteers, the Rough Riders. 6:30 a.m. July the 1st, 1898. Spanish artillery began pounding our positions, and thus began the great day of my life. I got on my horse, Little Texas. I rode up and down the lines, exhorting my men to hold their positions until the orders arrived. They did. Gentlemen, we are to act as a support group for the regular army's attack at Kettle Hill. A support group. Well, by Godfrey, we will be the finest support group this army has ever seen. Men, charge! And up Kettle Hill we went. I led that attack, riding out in front on my horse, Little Texas, as an example of courage to my men. They were actually running up that hill behind me, cutting through many barbed wire and stopping many of those whirling Mauser bullets with their own dear bodies. The Spaniards broke from that ridge, and I arrived first on top. Now, from this position, we began to lay down support gunfire for the regular army's attack at San Juan Heights. When that army started its final rush, the wolf again rose in my heart, and I decided that a flanking attack would be in order. And I turned to my men again and yelled, "Charge!" And down Kettle Hill and up San Juan Hill we went. Again, I led the attack, shooting anything I could see in sight. And when the smoke finally cleared, I found myself to be the ranking American officer furthest front of the American lines in Cuba. And when an enemy artillery shell landed very close to me, and sadly, killing several of my men and wounding others, but giving me only shrapnel in the wrist, one of my men wrote in his diary that night, "My God, those Spaniards just cannot kill Theodore Roosevelt." It was a bully good day.
There was a sad note, though, about the Cuban battles. You see, once they were over, the army delayed sending the troops home, and yellow fever was killing more men than the Spaniards had killed. Theodore wrote to Henry Cabot Lodge,
"Should the worst come to the worst, and I die, I'm quite content to go now and leave my children at least an honorable name. And old man, if I do go, I do wish that you would get that Medal of Honor for me anyhow. I should awfully like the children to have it, and I think I earned it."
But Theodore did not receive that medal, although he was highly recommended for it. You see, a group of officers finally wrote a letter to the High Command demanding that they change their policy and send the men home at once. Yet, to save their military careers, they signed the letter in a round robin, so no one would appear to be the instigator in speaking out. No one, that is, except Theodore Roosevelt, who also wrote a letter by himself, which was published in all of the newspapers. Well, this doomed his Congressional Medal of Honor, but the paper coverage of his heroics would bring him the Republican nomination for governor. Well, Theodore came home to Sagamore Hill, but our lives were constantly being interrupted by the press. Luckily, we had children who kept things in their proper perspective. One reporter asked our son Archie, "Where's the colonel?" And Archie replied, "I don't know where the colonel is, but father's taking a bath." Theodore was offered several well-paying jobs and large amounts of money to write his exploits for various magazines. But his heart was on the governorship, which he won in the election of November 1898.
And again, reform was my main concern. And over the next several years, we passed nearly 1,000 pieces of legislation. And because a good deal of that legislation put restrictions on the growing corporate monopolies and these huge trust-holding companies. This led to many run-ins with the leader of my own Republican Party in New York State, Thomas Platt. But I usually came out on top of these little political skirmishes because I would speak softly but carry a big stick.
And I immediately began remodeling the governor's mansion, which Thee said reminded him of a Chicago hotel. And our children's exploits began creeping into the press. Theodore always believed that one should have a rather long and loose string on children so they could explore, have fun, and discover life for themselves. He'd always been that way. It was not unusual for us to have one cousin or another come to Sagamore Hill to spend time, and I believe it was because of their Uncle Theodore. He would play games with them and become one of the children. Even as their exploits crept into the papers, Theodore would laugh at them. At one function at the mansion, the guests looked out the window only to see the governor's children outside in their pajamas throwing snowballs. On another occasion, the children planted a billiard ball in a bowl of luscious-looking plums, causing one absent-minded guest to nearly crack his teeth. And they had all kinds of small animals for pets, to which they gave names of real people in the news, without regard to gender. Well, one of Quentin's favorites was a female rabbit, to which he gave the unusual name of our local bishop, Bishop Doane. Well, at one function at the mansion, Quentin ran in yelling, "Father, Father, Bishop Doane has had twins!" Although I was a naturally reserved person, I was tolerant of my children's behavior. Once in church, Kermit pulled out a tooth during the sermon. He stood up and displayed that gory specimen for all to see. I simply feigned absorption in prayer. I certainly did not participate in the children's pastimes quite as much as Thee, but my attitude caused one child to remark, "When Mother was a little girl, she must have been a boy." I could not think of a higher compliment coming from a Roosevelt child.
Bill McKinley's re-election was almost certain, but just prior to our nominating convention, his vice president and very good friend, by the way, Garrett Hobart, died. And the eyes of many Republicans turned to Theodore Roosevelt to replace him on the ticket, especially those of Thomas Platt, who saw this as a chance to get me out of New York State. In fact, he once commented, "Roosevelt may well as stand under Niagara Falls and try to spit water back as to stop this nomination." However, there was another influential man who did not want me on that ticket, Ohio Senator Mark Hanna. And he was the real power behind Bill McKinley. He told one of his friends, "Don't you realize there would only be one heartbeat between the presidency and that madman Roosevelt?" And there was one other voice of opposition.
Oh, Theodore, reconsider this. I enjoy life here in Albany. For the first time, I'm able to spend time with you as we are together for state functions. And financially, we're better off than we've ever been. Besides the money from your writings, as governor, you're receiving $10,000 a year. Plus, we have this beautiful home and an expense allowance. As vice president, you would receive less money and not even be provided with a house. Well, I suppose you cannot stop fate. When Thee gave a rousing speech at the convention seconding McKinley's renomination, it seemed that his own vice presidential nomination was now inevitable. When Theodore was nominated, Mark Hanna told Bill McKinley, "Your duty to this country is to live 4 years from next March." So on March 4th, 1901, William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt were sworn into office.
And by the end of August, Edith and the children in the Adirondacks or mountains on vacation. The dear lady had certainly earned one. After the swearing in, she and the children went to go home to Sagamore Hill. There was no need for them to stay in Washington, as my only duty as the vice president was to preside over the Senate for 4 days and then adjourn it. By the end of April, I was of the opinion that the office of vice president ought to be totally abolished. But poor Edie. In the meanwhile, she had been going through trying days. Well, first, Archie had the chicken pox. Then Edith got poison ivy. Quentin somehow or other managed to lodge a mothball up his nose. Then Alice got kicked in the teeth at a dance and had to get emergency dental work done to save the loose teeth. I came home from a hunting trip with bronchitis, and of course I needed to be cared for. And Quentin went back in the hospital, this time with a seriously infected ear.
Just a typical few months for the Roosevelt family. And added to this, Theodore and I seem to have become surrogate parents for many of his Rough Riders. They were always asking Thee for help. During that same time period, one wrote to him, "Dear Colonel, I write you because I'm in trouble. I've shot a lady in the eye." "Oh, but Colonel, I did not mean to shoot that lady. It was all an accident, for I was shooting at my wife." Well, I was looking forward to a vacation with a little peace and quiet.
But that was not to be. On September the 6th, while speaking at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, President McKinley was shot. He died a little more than a week later on September the 14th. And so at the age of 40, Edith was now the First Lady of the United States. And at 42, I became the youngest man to hold that office. And I was relishing the thought and ready to throw myself into this job with bully enthusiasm. There were four main objectives I wanted to accomplish. Number one, we needed to have an expanded and a better prepared Navy, which we got. Two, I wanted to establish a brand new cabinet position, the Department of Commerce. And I wanted laws passed that would curtail these large trust holding companies. This was accomplished in 18 months, and we began to bring suits against giants such as Standard Oil and the like. Thirdly, to preserve our natural resources for future generations, along with Gifford Pinchot, who was my chief forester, during my administrations, we set aside over 230 million acres of land in national forests, national parks, oil reserves, and wildlife refuge. And finally, the war in Cuba showed us that for our national defense, we must have a canal across Central America. It took us too long to bring our ships from the East Coast to the West Coast and vice versa. When a revolution occurred in Central America in 1903, which perhaps was helped by the presence of some American warships, which just happened to be sitting off the coast at that time, we then immediately recognized the new nation of Panama. And within a year, work was begun on that most important project, the Panama Canal. My view of the presidency is this. I was a steward of the people, and I was bound to actively do whatever I could for the people. It was my right, it was my duty to do anything that the needs of the nation required, as long as it was not expressly forbidden by our Constitution or by our laws. But I did not usurp power, as some have said. What I did, greatly expand the use of executive power.
And I discovered that I could enjoy my new position. I hired a full-time social secretary to help me with correspondence and preparing schedules of whom to receive. My sitting room was right next to Theodore's second-floor office, so I could be near him and watch the comings and goings. In my own reserved way, I had helped my husband ever since he ran for governor, when I began sorting and dictating answers to his mail. Now I continued to sort the mail and read several newspapers daily, pointing out articles of interest to him. I would welcome his guests if he were busy. Well, at least some of them. Some I did not want to meet. I don't dislike them. I just don't want to live in the same world with them. I decided that my weekly reception would be in the form of a musicale.
Well, now, actually, Mrs. Roosevelt and I had a very long discussion about what form of entertainment would be fitting for the president's house. And she concluded that this was it.
At first, we had a violinist or a soloist, But later I brought in the Vienna Male Choir and the entire Philadelphia Orchestra. Theodore would attend, but his idea of thanking these acclaimed artists would be to give them an autographed copy of his book, The Rough Riders. Well, in the spring of 1902, Washington was abuzz with a rumor. The First Lady was expecting, although many dismissed it as idle gossip. I did not want to announce my pregnancy publicly until I had to, because I knew of all the fuss that it would cause. And it was for the best, because on May 9th I was taken ill and remained in bed for the next 12 days with a miscarriage.
But fortunately, Edith had a project to help divert her attention from her sorrow. In the past, numerous presidents had urged Congress to change and to update the presidential mansion. Well, the government had certainly outgrown the building. You know, originally, the first floor of the White House was to be the offices, the second floor, residence. Well, now there are offices up in the residence floor. However, unlike some of our predecessors, we wanted to retain that beautiful purity of James Hoband's original design.
Well, the main addition was a west wing, which housed the executive offices, freeing up 2 more second-floor rooms for living quarters. The state dining room was expanded, and outside landscaping removed that outdated greenhouse. The east room was also remodeled to look much as it does today. I worked closely with the architects and added 2 unique ideas. I suggested that all of the First Lady's portraits be placed in the downstairs corridor and be called the picture gallery. Now, with the seating in the state dining room expanded, I could not put together enough place settings from the prior administrations, so I ordered a complete new set of china, then had cabinets constructed on the ground floor corridor to display the best pieces of the prior place settings. By the time our term in office was over, that exhibit featured relics of almost all 25 administrations. And in the midst of all of this, I did have to undergo a second miscarriage.
I do not think that my eyes are blinded with affection when I say that Edith has combined to a degree that I have never seen before in any other woman. The power of being the best of wives and mothers, the wisest manager of the household, and yet at the same time, the ideal great lady and mistress of the White House. In fact, Edith even won the admiration of my longtime foe, Mark Hanna. Well, the story is one day Hannah noticed Edith and Quentin talking to a little friend of Quentin's, but the boy was wearing his hat. When they left, Hannah went over to that young boy and said to him, "Young man, you know whenever you ought to take your hat off, rather, whenever a woman speaks to you. And if Mrs. Roosevelt speaks to you, you keep it off for a week." Now, when the White House was being refurbished, I took 2 trips that had rather lasting effects. In fact, the first trip nearly ended my presidency in its first year. In September, I was up in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and the carriage I was riding in was rammed by one of those new electric trolleys. I was tossed to the ground, but sadly, my bodyguard, who had been seated right next to me, was killed as the trolley had driven over him. Just several feet spared me from a similar fate. Now, I received what I simply thought was a bad bruise on my left leg. However, 2 very serious operations had to be done to correct complications which had set in. Then, in November, I went bear hunting in Mississippi, and it was simply exasperating. I never got off a shot, and it was most embarrassing because we had allowed newspaper men to come with us on this trip. But one morning, my guide summoned me to come and shoot a black bear, which he had already lassoed and stunned. Of course, I absolutely refused to do such a thing. Well, it wasn't long before stories were being written about my great sportsmanship in this manner, and then a cartoonist for the Washington Post did a rendering of the whole scene of my sparing of that little bear, and before long, soft, toy, cuddly bears were being sold as Teddy's Bears. And then in 1904, I won election to the presidency presidency in my own right and immediately stated I would not seek another term.
That was a mistake, Theodore.
I'm sorry, Edith, but I felt that filling in for 3.5 years of McKinley's term certainly counted as my first term, and I would follow the example set by President Washington of having no man serve more than 2 consecutive terms. You know, ironically, although I did come to the presidency considered by many a jingoistic warmonger, during the 7.5 years of my administration, except for quelling a nasty resistance on the Philippine Islands, not one shot was fired against a foreign foe, and we were at peace. In fact, twice I was asked to be a broker for peace around the world. Once with the Russo-Japanese War, and for my efforts in these peace efforts, I was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1906. Also in that year, Edith and I went to Panama to view progress on the canal, and by doing so, I became the first president to travel abroad while still in office. That also was the year of one of the greatest controversies of my presidency. Began down in Brownsville, Texas. Now, I must tell you, before the story I'm going to tell you, I was considered a great friend of the American Negro. Just weeks after I became president, I invited the great Negro leader, Booker T. Washington, to come to Washington and to the White House and to have dinner with Edith and me. I was shocked by the outcry over this. Some of the newspaper headlines are absolutely atrocious. One read, "Roosevelt is a rank Negrophilist." But now, there were accusations that members of an all-Negro Army unit had entered Brownsville, Texas, shooting indiscriminately and killing a citizen. In the Army investigation which followed, all 167 members of that unit were silent. They were protecting the guilty ones. My decision was to dishonorably discharge all 167 members. The outcry now was I was against the Negro. But I'm sorry, their race had nothing to do with my decision. I would have done the same thing to any Army unit that was guilty of such an outrage. I believe that the only wise and honorable and Christian thing to do is to treat each black man and each white man strictly on their merits as a man.
Theodore, you did not talk about the most talked about event of your administration that also happened in 1906. On February 17th, the wedding in the East Room of our daughter Alice to Congressman Nicholas Longworth. It was a simply splendid affair, with Theodore as much center stage as his daughter. But Alice understood. As she commented the year before, when he dominated her cousin Eleanor's wedding to distant relative Franklin Roosevelt, "Father wants to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral." At the end of the ceremony, Alice walked over, put her hands on my shoulders, and affectionately kissed me.
As my presidency was winding down, I handpicked my Secretary of War and my very good friend, Bill Taft, to be my successor. I was proud that we had passed the Food and Drug Act, the first one, that we had declared that we did have a right to intervene in Latin America to maintain stability in this hemisphere, that we did have a right to exercise international police power. I, in my administration, decreased our national debt by $90 million, and we rooted corruption out of government. And then, near the end of my administration, I sent our Navy, which now was the second largest in the world, on an around-the-world trip. The Great White Fleet, it was called. This was something that the German Navy and even the great British Navy thought impossible to do, to send their fleet on an around-the-world voyage. But we did it, and by doing so, we let the world know, and our own citizens know, that the United States of America had now taken our place greatest of nations. On March the 4th, 1909, I proudly watched as Big Bill Taft was sworn in as the 27th president. You know, I think Edith and I are in the curious and very pleasant position of maybe having enjoyed the White House more than any other presidential couple I can think of. And yet we're entirely willing to leave it all behind and to look forward to a life full of interest and happiness.
I returned home to Sycamore Hill.
And I left the country. Well, Kermit and I were going to go on a nearly year-long hunting expedition into darkest Africa. The Smithsonian Institution was sponsoring our trip, and the specimens we brought back would be for their usage. Also, Scribner's magazine was going to pay me quite well for sending back stories from the jungle. My reason for undertaking this actually was twofold. One, I needed a job. Oh, there was no such thing as a presidential pension, as I well believe there should not be. As I oftentimes proudly told European leaders, I live in a country where a common man can rise up to a position as great as any monarch in this world. And then when his time is up, he returns and he becomes an unpensioned citizen, taking with him only the glories which he has earned. Oh, and my second reason? Well, that was to give my friend Bill Taft a chance at being president without Theodore looking over his shoulder. Periodically, we did come out of the jungle, circling around to Nairobi, where I would send my magazine articles.
And letters home to me. Oh, sweetest of all sweet girls. Last night I dreamed that I was with you, that our separation was but a dream. And when I waked up, it was almost too hard to bear. Well, one must pay for everything. You have been the real happiness in my life, and it is natural and right.
That I should constantly be more and more lonely without you. Darling, I love you so. In a little over 4 months, I shall see you. How very happy we have been these past 23 years. Signed, your own lover.
Well, I joined Thea in Egypt, and then we went on a whirlwind tour of Europe. And when we returned in June of 1910, we were welcomed back as royalty. Every dignitary you could think of greeted us at the docks. Except for one.
Bill Taft. A rift had developed between us. Well, mainly because he was drifting away from my progressive reforms. So in 1912, I challenged the sitting president for the Republican nomination and lost. No, I did not lose. I had that nomination stolen from me. There were 13 primaries held that year. I won 9 of them. The rank-and-file Republican wanted me to be their nominee, but the party men did not. And many of the men who supported me were not allowed to be seated at that convention. And Bill Taft got renominated. But then I was asked to be a third-party candidate on the Progressive Party ticket, or as it became better known, the Bull Moose Party ticket.
Theodore, remember that often one wants to do the hardest and the noblest thing, but sometimes it does not follow that it is the right thing. This is nonsense. You shall never be president again.
But I fully well must try, Edith, because new ideas had to be heard. But in making them heard, a lot of my lifelong friendships would be broken, including that with Bill Taft. On October the 14th, 1912, I was at the Gilpatrick Hotel in Milwaukee, leaving to go give a campaign speech at another location. Outside, of course, there was a crowd, and someone yelled out, "No third term!" And a shot rang out. The bullet entered the right side of my body, but luckily it was slowed and slightly deflected by my rather thickly folded speech and my eyeglass case. It came to rest a mere quarter of an inch from my heart. Oh, by the way, I still went and gave that speech. I spoke for an hour and a half. It takes more than a bullet to stop a bull moose.
I I arrived the next day at Mercy Hospital and stayed by his side for 5 days there in Chicago. The doctors decided not to remove the bullet. There was the danger of infection. I kept everyone, press and politicians, away from Theodore. One correspondent was allowed, and his story amused me. This is what he wrote in the newspaper. All the bosses that had gone before, Hannah, Platt, were amateurs to her. That sedate and determined woman, from the moment of her arrival, took charge of affairs and reduced the colonel to pitiable subjection. Up to her advent, he was throwing bombshells into his doctors and directing his own medical campaigns. The moment she arrived, a hush fell upon TR. He became as meek as Moses. No such tyrannical sway has ever been seen in the history of American politics. The article went on to say, Theodore remarked in Edith's presence, this thing about ours being a campaign against Balt's rule is a fake. I was never so Balt's ruled in my life as I am at this moment.
That was very good, Edith. As you can see, my wife certainly had her own way about her, and I think she always considered me nothing more than her fifth boy. Whereas I was bombastic, Edith got her point across in her own sly way. Give you an example. One time up at Sagamore Hill, I was chopping down trees, and when one of them fell, it landed on and brought down our telephone lines. Well, Edie just gave me one of her wry smiles when I told her, now you know, Edith, this is all your fault, because as the chief forester, you did not properly mark the trees to be felled. However, I will not say another word about this incident, as long as you do not. But you see, my wife didn't have to say a word. She had a language all herself. That telephone would never ring now that Edie wouldn't let out with a little tiny chuckle. And when that cursed thing got out of order, which it did occasionally, Edie would tell the servant to see if the wires were still up or if the trees were down.
Now remember, Thee, you only have to live with me. I have to live with you.
But I must tell you, Edith made me a much better man. Because although I did love her, I was at times thoughtless and selfish. And whenever I was, Edith would point this out to me instead of submitting to it. And if she had not done so, it would have made her life much harder and my life much less happy. I really do believe I am as much in love with her today as I was on the day I married her. She is so wise and good, pretty and charming.
Theodore, you're talking like you're writing my obituary.
Well, in defeat, I took another one of my trips. This time, Kermit and I were going to attempt to go down a heretofore unexplored river. It was a tributary of the Amazon, and it was known simply as the River of Doubt.
Life was certainly changing, and Sagamore Hill was becoming a silent, more mature place. Ted and Ethel had both married. Alice now spent most of her time in Cincinnati, as Nick had lost his congressional seat in the 1912 election, and Archibald and Quentin were away at school. I would have loved to have had Theodore at my side. I told him, life is short. Let us spend it together. But Theodore always needed adventure, and in that jungle he almost lost his life. An old wound became infected, and combined with jungle fever, he felt he was at death's door.
I called Kermit to my side one night, and I told him to leave me in the jungle to die. I was slowing up that entire expedition. I was taking needed food away from men who needed it. But Kermit, being a typical son, did not listen to his father. They literally carried me out that jungle. And the river was immediately renamed Rio Teodoro. And when we returned to the States, there was no one there to greet us at the docks. The nation had forgotten T.R. But a new adventure was facing me, and that was war in Europe. And I let it be known, although I was nearing 60 years of age, I wanted to lead my Rough Riders into battle. When this became public, I had requests from 200,000 men who were willing to follow me into battle But President Wilson said no. He said my cavalry would be no match for the weapons of modern war. So instead, all 4 of my sons would go and fight on the front lines. Kermit, being so eager, he even joined the British Army. Our daughter Ethel even did her part. With her husband, a doctor, she was serving as a nurse in a hospital in France.
Before he went overseas, Archie was married on April 14th, 1917. Quentin also brought home a young lady, Flora Payne, to whom he was secretly engaged. On his last night home, I tucked Quentin into bed. He was always the baby, the son I associated most closely with thee. My fine, good little bad boy. They've all gone away now from the house on the hill, but all is quite right and for the best.
I traveled the country exhorting for an all-out, unified effort to win this war. And on one of these trips, I was seated at a restaurant. And who should I see across the room but none other than Big Bill Taft? Well, we sat down, we had an amiable chat, and we shook hands. How good it was to know that we were no longer enemies. And by the summer of 1918, Kermit, Archie, and Ted Jr. had all won medals for bravery or for wounds which they had sustained in battle. July the 17th, 1918, we received word that our youngest son, Quentin, had been shot down and killed behind enemy lines. Quentin's mother and I are very glad that he got to the front, had a chance to render service to his country, to show the stuff that was in him before his fate befell him.
You cannot bring up boys as eagles and expect them to turn out as sparrows. Quentin was buried in France.
As the Bible says, where the tree falls, there let it lie.
We spent the rest of the day doing our chores. Thee sat at his desk working, but tears continually fell from his eyes. The next day, he had a speaking engagement at the Republican State Convention, and not even grief would postpone it. In the middle of the speech, he set aside his notes and said to a hushed audience,
The finest, bravest, the best of our young men have sprung eagerly forward to face death for a high ideal. When these gallant boys on the golden crest of life gladly face death, shall not we, who have been left behind, who this time have not been found worthy of that great adventure, try to live our lives in such a way as to make this a better country for the women who have sent these men to battle and for the children who will come after them.
One friend observed that the day Quentin died was the day the little boy died in Theodore. In November of 1918, Theodore was hospitalized for 44 days with inflammatory rheumatism. I moved into a small room next to his and remained there for his hospital stay. But on Christmas Day, although he was still weak, Theodore was allowed to come home. Alice, Ethel, Archie, and their families were there with us. At home, he tried to continue working and wrote a letter to be read at the American Defense Society. It was on a topic he had spoken of frequently, the hyphenated American. On Sunday evening, January 5th, 1919, I sat with Theodore. He was reading, and I was playing solitaire. He looked at me and said,
I wonder if you will ever know how much I love Sagamore Hill.
At about that same time, his letter was being read at the American Defense Society meeting.
The immigrant who comes here in good faith and becomes American should be treated equally. It is an outrage to discriminate because of creed or birthplace or origin. But this is predicated upon that man's becoming an American and nothing but an American. If he tries to keep segregated with men of his own origin and separated from the rest of America, he's not doing his part as an American. We have room but for one flag, the American flag. We have room but for one language, the English language. We are a nation, not a hodgepodge of foreign nationalities.
At about midnight, Theodore said to his manservant,
Put out the light, please.
those were his last words. Archie cabled his brothers. The old lion is dead. Theodore, only 60 years old, had died quietly in his sleep. He was buried 2 days later in a small cemetery near Sagamore Hill. One of the last people to leave that gravesite was Bill Taft. Hundreds of letters came. Historian W.R. Thayer wrote, "Yet I see clearly that America is going to appreciate him more and more and to understand him better, and I have no doubt he will stand in history as our greatest after Lincoln. Let me urge you to take some consolation in realizing that you, Edith, were indispensable to his full development. He would have been less but for you." Well, I took a page from Theodore's book, decided to travel to ease my pain. As a matter of fact, for the next several decades, travel around the world became my routine. There was so much of life still to be lived, some happy and some not so happy. Our son Ted became part of the Harding administration, and then in 1924 ran for governor of New York. His cousin Eleanor violently opposed him, bringing up his possible involvement in the Teapot Dome scandal, although there was never any proof of that rumor. Well, that started the rift between the Hyde Park Roosevelts and the Oyster Bay Roosevelts. When Franklin was nominated for president, I received letters congratulating me, many thinking him to be my son. Well, to set the country straight, I made a public appearance at Madison Square Garden for Herbert Hoover. As it was, I would carry on a friendly letter correspondence with Eleanor during her term as First Lady, and even during the war, changed my opinion of Franklin, who, although he was on the wrong side of the fence, was a nice man. Alice, at the age of 41, gave birth to a healthy baby girl, and the births of other grandchildren brought much happiness. The only problem with living so long is you do experience so much death. Both of our sons, Kermit and Ted Jr., served during the Second World War. But Kermit, I later found out, due to his drinking problems, had been stationed in Alaska, and he had taken his own life. 1 year later, on June 1944, D-Day on Utah Beach, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., at the age of 56, was the oldest man in the first invasion wave. Because of a miscalculation, his forces were landed 3/4 of a mile too far south, which put them only 100 yards from enemy fire. Well, Ted led his troops to a safe position, and then under heavy fire, returned to direct wave after wave of other troops to that safe haven. General Omar Bradley stated it was the greatest act of bravery he had ever seen. So it was fitting that Ted should die of a heart attack while on the battlefield, July 11th, 1944. He was buried with full honors in Normandy. Ted won the Congressional Medal of Honor. That same honor denied his father. In 2 world wars, Ted had been awarded every possible combat medal. Well, all of 1947, I was bedridden. And on September 30th, 1948, after falling into a coma, I passed on from this life at the age of 87. I had once said that on my tombstone, I wanted the words, "Everything she did was for the happiness of others." But the words that might be more appropriate for all members of our family are the words that Theodore once wrote in eulogy of Quentin.
Only those are fit to live who do not fear to die. And none are fit to die who have shrunk from the joy of life. For life and death are but parts of that same great advantage and never yet was worthy adventure worthily carried forth by the man who put his own personal safety first. All of us who stand ready for sacrifice, all of us who stand ready to give service, we are the torchbearers. And as such, we are happy to run with the torches until the day we fall, content to pass them onto the hands of other runners. Because it is we who have dared to live the great adventure!
Thank you very much for the Wills. I want you to know that the Wills have DVDs that they are willing to sell at the door as you're leaving. I don't know how many you have.
We do 32 different presidents. And so we have the DVDs on all the presidents that we do here tonight. Talk to my wife. We have a really great deal. Basically, if you buy 2, you get another one for free. But I do want to give you a update to our show. One of the last things that President Clinton did before he left office, on the recommendation of the Army, he finally awarded the Medal of Honor to Theodore Roosevelt for his service in the Spanish-American War. So, Joe, thank you for having us. Thank you, folks.
Now, don't forget, next week, we still have some openings for next week's dinner, and also you can call the office for the Kentucky Derby. Thank you, Pat. Good night, and on your way out, don't forget to buy your CBDs.